In 1988, Lydia Bradey became the first woman to summit Mount Everest without oxygen. And she did it solo, with no Sherpas and no backup. It should have been front page news, a global headline, a milestone in mountaineering history. But when she got back down to base camp, her team was gone. They'd packed up and left. And then the betrayal began. Her own teammates, including Rob Hall, one of the most famous guides in Everest history, told the world she was lying. They said she hallucinated climbing to the summit, that she never reached it at all. And she wasn't met with celebration when she got back down. Instead, she was banned from Nepal and erased from history. So what really happened up there, and how does someone survive the world's highest mountain only to be buried by the people she trusted most? Before Everest and before the controversy, before she became the first woman to summit without oxygen, Lydia Bradey was just a kid from Christchurch, New Zealand. She was born in 1961 and raised by a fiercely independent single mother. Her mother, who was denied education that she really wanted, drilled one thing into Lydia, and that was don't grow old with regrets. And that stuck with Lydia. And a great example of Lydia being pretty headstrong and stubborn was when she wanted to get out of religion class. And she found out that a Seventh-day Adventist classmate was exempt from the class, so Lydia forged a note claiming the same, even though she wasn't. Her mom didn't stop her. Instead, she signed the note, and Lydia got out of the class. And that's when she learned that sometimes, if you want to make a change, you have to make it happen yourself. And that was kind of Lydia's way of doing things when she had to. But it's funny because she was somebody who did all this climbing later on, but as a kid, she was not athletic at all. If you see any interviews with her, she talks about how she was just absolutely terrible at sports. It never came naturally to her, but that never stopped her from trying either. And eventually, something kind of clicked. Lydia was around 13 when her mom signed her up for an outdoor education course, and this was a hike through a rough trail in New Zealand's southern Alps. There were switchbacks and scree slopes, loose rock. It was pretty dangerous, and Lydia was nervous. Because, again, nothing about sports had ever felt natural to her. But something that day shifted on that mountain. As they gained altitude and kept climbing, every step to her started to feel right and good, and like it was actually getting easier. And then one of the guides with them said something that stuck with her forever. He said, some of you might go on to become trampers, and occasionally one or two of you will go on to become a climber. And she said, climber? What is that? She didn't even know what it meant, but it sounded dangerous and it sounded cool. She said, I didn't even know what that was, but then I knew I wanted to become a climber. And that's when a new identity took root. Lydia was hiking every chance she got. She was scrambling, she was bushwhacking, and pushing her limits. And then she joined the Peninsula Tramping Club in Christchurch. But when she tried to join the Canterbury Mountaineering Club, the serious club for the real climbers, she was told flat out that it was for men only. And Lydia's response was just, that's stupid. She wasn't trying to make a statement, she just wanted to climb with others and be a part of the club. Eventually, enough pressure mounted from various people, and the rule was changed. So at 17, she joined the club. And quickly, she became one of its most active members. The first gate had tried to slam shut in her face, and it wouldn't be the last. Lydia's first summit was with her mentor, Margaret Clark, a legend in New Zealand mountaineering. They tackled a 3,000-meter peak together, and Lydia was eager. She was super hungry to learn, and Margaret took her under her wings and showed her the ropes, kind of looked out for her, and kept her safe. And when they reached the top, Lydia said something shifted for her. She said, I got a huge kick from standing on the summit. That's when I knew, this is it. This is what I want my life to be. At that point, she didn't even know if you could make a living from climbing. It wasn't really a career, and it wasn't normal. No one she knew was doing it. Not long after this, she left home and was kind of drifting around, stressed, trying to figure out what to do with her life. And while she was out walking one day, she just felt this strange sensation come over her. She said something inside of her just said, hey, just go climbing. It wasn't a plan. It was just something that she knew she had to pursue. And it would also become her mantra in life every time things got messy. Just go climbing. At 18, Lydia left home and started working at Mount Cook Village, New Zealand's high-altitude heartland. And it was climber central, and she was in her element. There's all these gritty, tough, sunburnt, obsessed people who lived for the mountains. And Lydia wanted to be a part of that. She pushed hard and she climbed constantly. She wanted to prove herself as a strong, capable climber. One of them. All these climbers and who just lived for the mountains just felt like her tribe. But it wasn't all fun and adrenaline. One day she was on a trip with other mountaineers, and a man and his wife left camp against the advice of the others. Lydia watched later as a rescue helicopter brought the woman's body back. Her husband had fallen and taken her with him. A week later, 2 more climbers from the same trip died. People she'd been sharing camp with and eating and laughing with. And it shattered her. After that, Lydia paid closer attention to the weather, to her gut, and to things that you can't always explain, but you learn to not ignore. She later tackled the Balfour face of Mount Graham, a brutal 19-hour climb full of ice chimneys and crevasses. It's one of the most technical ascents in New Zealand. She was exhausted when she finally made the summit. And that's when this all started to feel real to her. Like this wasn't just something that she loved, it was becoming her life. But the next mountain would almost break her. After the Balfour face, Lydia set her sights on Denali, North America's highest peak. She joined a team heading up the south face, and this was her first time in Alaska, and Denali was a different beast. It's massive, cold, and totally unpredictable. And the climb was brutal. They faced whiteouts, deep snow, and temperatures that froze their gear solid. Progress was slow, and the team faced constant setbacks. And that climb fell apart totally. And so did Lydia's confidence. Up until then, she'd always felt like a solid team member back in New Zealand, but Denali made her see something that no young climber ever wants to admit. She said, "I just wasn't strong enough. My skills weren't where they needed to be." She spent days crying alone in a frozen tent, just devastated. And not by the cold or being left alone when her climbing partners went elsewhere, but by the realization that if she wanted to climb these big mountains, she had a lot of work to do. So she gave herself a deadline. She said 1 year to get stronger, smarter, and tougher. And she was going to go where the best climbers in the world went to suffer to get sharp. And that was Yosemite. Lydia Bradey did something that no woman had ever done before. She summited Everest without oxygen. And instead of being celebrated, she got totally erased from her own story. And that kind of hit me, because a lot of us know what it feels like to be underestimated, doubted, or even dismissed. When I moved here to the Yukon in a cabin with no plumbing and very little amenities and a bunch of dogs, people thought that I'd lost it. Taking a risk and doing something hard is one thing, but doing it while people doubt you or outright dismiss you is a whole other battle. And that's where therapy can make a huge difference. And that's why I'm excited to say that today's paid partner is BetterHelp. BetterHelp makes therapy available online, so whether you're navigating change, you're working through something tough, or you're just trying to figure things out, you can easily find the support that you need. BetterHelp is a platform where therapists and their clients can communicate effectively and get the most out of therapy. All you need to do is just fill out a questionnaire and you'll match with a therapist as soon as possible. And if you don't feel like that first therapist is the right fit for you, you can easily switch to another until you find someone that you're really comfortable with. So if you're going through a tough time right now, or you just feel like you could use a little extra support, let BetterHelp connect you to a therapist from the comfort of your own home. Visit BetterHelp.com/adventuresgonewrong, and you can find the link in the description below, or you can choose Adventures Gone Wrong during sign up and enjoy a special discount on your first month. But she thought if she could handle Yosemite, she'd come out a stronger, smarter climber, ready for whatever came next. This was the proving ground for elite climbers. Towering granite walls like El Capitan and Half Dome, nearly a kilometer straight up into the air. And you didn't just climb them, you lived on them. Days on the wall, sleeping in a harness or a portaledge, a tiny tent hanging off the cliff, hauling your gear and your food and your waste. Totally exposed and nowhere to hide. It was terrifying to Lydia, but it was also thrilling. And it was exactly what she needed at the time. She teamed up with a climber named John, a guy who had already taken a massive fall soloing the Zodiac route. He nearly died climbing that, but when he got down, he's asked Lydia to join him. He said he wanted to do it again, and she was totally in. Zodiac wasn't just any climb. It's one of the hardest aid routes on El Cap. There's overhanging rock, tiny holds, gear placements that may or may not catch you. And at one point, Lydia looked down and realized she was suspended hundreds of meters in the air, the wall right in front of her face, and nothing but space below her. And she said, this is what climbing is. It's being totally present, absorbed. You become part of the landscape. They did make the summit, and Lydia became the first woman to summit Zodiac. And that wall changed everything for her, because if she could survive that, she thought maybe she was ready to take on something even bigger. Now she wanted altitude. And the dream was starting to take shape. Mount Everest was now on her mind. And the first step toward it would take her higher than she had ever been. Lydia was invited to join an expedition to Cho Oyu, the 6th highest mountain in the world. It wasn't Everest, but it was a serious test at altitude. And she was 23 at the time, still broke and still trying to prove herself. Before they'd even reached base camp, she picked up a stomach bug and a chest cold. By the time they got to Camp 1, the altitude was totally wrecking her. Breathing hurt, and walking was a slog. She would take 3 steps, take a rest, then take another 3 steps and rest. At night, it was so cold she thought that her feet might be freezing solid. She was exhausted and nauseated, and probably dealing with early signs of pulmonary edema, but she didn't quit. Then things got worse. At Camp 4, her tent mate Steve started vomiting. He was confused, barely able to move. And they weren't just sick, they were actually being poisoned. Carbon monoxide from the stove used to melt snow was building up inside the tent. Lydia had to get Steve down fast, and it took 3 days. 3 days of descent while fighting altitude sickness, illness, and fear. And when they finally got back to base camp, he recovered. They hadn't summited, but Lydia had answered a bigger question. Could she perform up high? Stay calm? Keep going when everything hurt? And she found the answer to that. She could. She said, I realized I could climb at high altitude. I was strong. I didn't let the team down. That mountain didn't give her glory, but it gave her proof. And with that, Everest stopped being a dream. Now, she knew she could survive the death zone. And that changed everything. Next up was Bhutan, a rarely visited region where Lydia joined a British expedition. Their goal was a massive sacred peak called Gangkhar Puensum. Climbing it wasn't just physically hard, it was controversial. In Bhutanese culture, the highest mountains are home to spirits. Some locals believe that summiting these mountains was highly disrespectful. But the government had recently opened these peaks to climbers, and this might be one of the last expeditions allowed in the area. The trail in was wild. It was muddy and slippery. There were roots and narrow ledges, and porters and yaks hauled their gear while the team slogged on for days. Eventually, they reached the mountain, and it was intimidating. Sheer ice, rocky cliffs, and waist-deep snow. Lydia and her climbing partner, John Muir, decided to go light and fast. They didn't take a rope, just foam pads, bivy bags, and a stove. At over 6,000 meters, they spent night after night out, and it was extremely cold because of the lack of gear they had. They spent the next day wading through this waist-deep, heavy, sticky snow before they could get to the summit, and that's when the clouds moved in, and they knew a storm was coming. After 5 days on the mountain, Lydia started getting sick. Headaches, vomiting, she was dehydrated. So they took shelter in a crevasse, hoping to wait out the storm. Like they were literally inside a crack in the ice. Hiding from the storm, which is terrifying. And then, even more terrifying, is the floor started collapsing underneath them, creating this huge bottomless hole inside this shelter. That's terrifying. Absolutely terrifying. Nope, you couldn't pay me enough to lay in a crevasse for the night. But, of course they wanted to live, so they had to rebuild the floor, and so they tried to do that, digging and packing snow between waves of getting sick because they were so nauseous. And then just when you thought it couldn't get any worse, the avalanches started. Yes, avalanches. Not just one, not just two. There were multiple avalanches, and the third one buried Lydia alive. She couldn't move, she could barely breathe, but she did have one arm free. She thought, this is it, what a terrible way to die. But then she was able to start digging herself out with that one free arm slowly. And John had been partially buried as well and swept downhill. But he was able to claw his way out of the avalanche too, and he hiked back up and dug her free. What a nightmare. They were soaked, shaking, and totally out of strength. And then came the fourth avalanche. And this one, she had to swim in the snow to keep on top of it or she'd be buried alive again. And in total, there were 6 freaking avalanches that they had to go through. When the weather finally broke, they made it down, wading through this bottomless snow, navigating cliffs in a whiteout. They didn't summit, they barely made it down, but for now, that was enough. In 1986, Lydia had proven that she could handle technical climbs, high altitude, and survival level storms. Now it was time for K2, the world's second highest mountain and one of the deadliest. She joined an expedition with 2 fellow New Zealanders, Rob Hall and Gary Ball. They'd all known each other for years. They trained together, climbed together, and they trusted each other. Lydia and Gary got along really well. She was feeling a bit of tension with Rob, and so she kind of teamed up together with Gary. Rob was aware of the mounting problems, but Lydia said he wouldn't approach them, let alone address the issues. Their first task was ferrying loads up the mountain and try and find a safe route. They had to backtrack a lot, and the big group kept splitting up to find these better routes. And then Gary and Linda got separated from the others, and that's when the shit hit the fan. Lydia later called this one of the most formative experiences of her life. She was roped to Gary at the time and carefully picking their way down through deep snow. It was slow and tense and the kind of terrain where you just know something could go wrong. And then it did. Gary vanished. One step and he disappeared, swallowed by a hidden crevasse. The rope snapped tight around Lydia's waist and she was suddenly being dragged towards the edge. Her heels were skidding and trying to dig into the snow. She slammed her axe into the ice and dug in her crampons, fought that pull, but it was too strong. She said it was like a movie moment. I thought, this is it. I'm going to go in after him. And then just before she got to the edge, there was a jolt. The rope suddenly stopped. Lydia lay there shaking, staring into the black hole where Gary had disappeared, and he had landed on a jumble of ice blocks. So he had stopped himself, or the ice had stopped him. But he couldn't climb out of it easily because the walls were sheer ice and super slippery. So for 2 hours, Lydia held the rope, watching and waiting while Gary inched his way back to the surface. When he finally crawled out, he totally collapsed beside and exhausted Lydia. By the end of July, tensions began to build up between Lydia and Rob. Rob was starting to resent the amount of time Lydia was spending with the American team. And then, at that point, Gary started to side with Rob, and he drew away from Lydia. Then in early August, Rob threatened to fire her. Lydia was stunned and furious. She wasn't being reckless, she was climbing hard and carrying her weight, but she was also outspoken and independent, and Rob didn't like that. No one reached the summit that season, but the damage had been done. Their friendship cracked, and that break would come back to haunt her on Everest. 2 years after K2, Lydia got the call. Rob Hall, Gary Ball, and Bill Atkinson were heading to Everest, and they asked her to join the team. It should have been a dream team, a small New Zealand group teaming up with the Slovak team. No Sherpas, no commercial circus, just climbers. But whatever cracks had started on K2, well, they hadn't healed, and Lydia could feel it. There was meetings that were happening without her, decisions that were made that she wasn't involved with, and she wasn't being treated as an equal team member. So she focused on something else, a solo, no-oxygen summit attempt. There was just one problem, though. Her permit didn't technically cover a solo ascent. Rob and Gary weren't too happy with her plan. They said if she tried it, they would disassociate from her, and they didn't want to be connected to anything illegal. But there's a bit of flawed logic in that, because they were also now climbing a route without a permit. In fact, the whole New Zealand team was going to try a route they didn't have a permit for. Lydia said the plan was to apply for it retroactively, which was not uncommon at the time. And the Slovak team offered her something else, and that was support. They made the mountain feel like an adventure again, not a tense business meeting where she was barely tolerated, and they welcomed her into their planning. She would hang out with them in the evenings, and they backed her solo attempt. And one of them even helped her secure coverage under a different permit. It wasn't ideal, but it was legal. And then the storm hit. The whole team, including Lydia, climbed to Camp 2, but as the weather got worse, she decided to descend and conserve her energy, and just waited out at base camp. And the Slovak team was going to do the same. But Rob and Gary stayed high and were going to try for the summit. When she told them that her plan was to go back down, they said, if you go down, we'll be one day ahead of you when the weather clears, and you'll have to climb on your own. And she was fully aware of that and okay with it. In fact, she probably preferred it at the time. She spent her 27th birthday at base camp. And 5 days later, the storm broke. The Slovaks headed up, and so did Lydia. Rob, Gary, and Bill tried to summit, but they turned back and were too tired, so they were heading home. They told Lydia that she'd be on her own. Lydia was alone at Camp 2 at about 6,500 meters when the Slovaks came down, exhausted and out of time. They were heading home as well. But she wasn't. She kept going. The next day, she pushed to Camp 3 at 7,300 meters. Then she pushed onto the South Col. By midday, she was there, just enough time to rest before a summit attempt that night. And remember, this was 1988. There was no forecast, no internet, and there was no fixed ropes above 7,900 meters. So she was actually pretty scared. And there was a Spanish team heading up around the same time. They were all using oxygen, though. And they all left at 2 a.m. Lydia followed behind them, on her own. Slowly, she made her way up through the dark. And at the south summit, she stopped. And she realized that she had enough energy to go back down safely. Maybe enough to keep going, but she wasn't sure. And that's when she saw the Spanish team coming back. One had frostbite, another was showing signs of cerebral edema, and they were just wrecked. And at that moment, the Spanish team radioed base camp to tell them what was going on. And that's when the New Zealand team, Rob, Gary, and Bill, heard where she was. They knew that she was on the South Summit and minutes from making history. But they left anyways. They packed up, took the money, took the radio, and abandoned their teammate as she climbed toward the top of the world. No one would be waiting for her at base camp. No backup, no support if she ran into trouble coming down. On Everest, descent is where most climbers die. And Lydia would face it completely alone. The final ridge was steep and narrow and exhausting. Every step for her was a battle, and then she got to a point where there was nothing left to climb. Lydia Bradey stood on the summit of Mount Everest. No oxygen, no teammates, and no audience, just her alone. People asked if she was elated, but she said, I was exhausted, but also relieved because she was now able to go back down finally. She sat down for about 15 minutes on the summit, and then her fingers started to go numb. Her camera was frozen, so she couldn't take any pictures, and she had just enough energy to think one thing: I'll survive, but only if I get moving. And so she did. She turned around and started the descent. At 8,650 meters on the way back down, she realized that she would make it back down, that she had enough strength. And she said, yes, I'm going to make it. 9 hours later, yes, 9 cold hours, alone, drained, she finally staggered into Camp 4. She had done it, and whether or not anyone would believe her, Lydia Bradey had just made history. She was the first woman to summit Everest without oxygen. When she finally reached base camp, the winds turned savage. The Slovak team was missing. All radio contact with them was lost. Rob, Gary, and Bill were long gone, and Lydia was hit with a wave of relief, grief, and betrayal all at once. She was close with the Slovaks and really had a great time hanging out with them, and now they were gone. Her own team abandoned her, and it was about to get way worse. Back in Kathmandu, there was no celebration, no welcoming committee, no flowers, just a letter both Rob and Gary had signed saying they didn't believe that Lydia had reached the summit. She was absolutely stunned. Her initial reaction was, why would they do that? Why would they say that? While she was still dragging herself down the mountain, they'd already started talking, whispering, and putting doubt in everyone about her summit. They said she didn't make it, that she was confused, that she might have been hallucinating the whole thing. Rob told the press, we don't believe she went to the summit. She didn't even seem to know what day it was. Gary suggested that she'd fabricated it for attention. They didn't just doubt her, they mocked her, and they turned her into a punchline. The media ran with it and called it Lydia Gate. And there was more at stake than just egos. Rob and Gary were building a guiding business, and a rogue, unpermitted solo attempt threatened their reputation with sponsors and officials, so they distanced themselves from her. And they told everyone that Lydia had broken the law, that she was reckless, and that her permit wasn't valid. But what they didn't say was that Lydia had secured coverage and was added to the other team's permit after the climb. It wasn't ideal, but it was legal. Lydia claims that they also lied about the route that they were on, so it wouldn't appear that they also didn't have a permit. But none of that mattered. Nobody believed her. The New Zealand Alpine Club refused to recognize her climb, and Nepal banned her from the country for 3 years. And Lydia, who was exhausted and alone, was publicly being accused of lying about the hardest thing she'd ever done, and that she'd worked up to for years. But she knew she had to be careful because the Nepalese tourism ministry was furious about this controversy. A typical ban for an unauthorized summit was 10 years. So, on advice of others, she said very little. Downplayed the climb, and she said that she'd gone higher than planned just to take pictures. But she never said that she didn't summit. But she also didn't say that she did. And later she admitted that was probably the wrong move, but she simply didn't know what else to do. She felt totally alone, but she actually wasn't. First, Margaret Clark called immediately to back her, and then others followed. Margaret said there's a code amongst mountaineers. No matter how close you get to the summit of a mountain, if you don't actually climb it, you don't claim it. In the end, Lydia avoided harsher punishment. She didn't face any criminal charges and got the 3-year ban. But her reputation was in ruins. Eventually, though, the truth started to surface. The Spanish climbers confirmed they'd seen her just below the summit. One of them said there's no way she wasn't going for it. She was clearly strong, in control, and right there. Of course she summited. Veteran New Zealand mountaineer Graham Dingle backed her too, saying he simply looked at the facts, the timing, the Spanish accounts, and that it all lined up. A Spanish journalist, also a climbing historian, dug into the records and even interviewed all of those involved. And he came to the same conclusion, that she summited. More climbers began to speak up in her defense, and then came the biggest validation of all, Elizabeth Hawley. The unofficial record keeper of Himalayan climbing, Hawley, was famously skeptical. But after reviewing Lydia's summit report, talking to other climbers, and hearing her story firsthand, she believed her. Lydia's ascent was then officially added to the Himalayan database. The New Zealand Alpine Club still refused to recognize it though. Lydia Bradey had made history and almost no one knew. Lydia didn't fight for the spotlight though. She didn't launch a PR campaign and didn't argue with the Alpine Club. She didn't chase sponsorships or try to rewrite the headlines. She just kept climbing and guiding and teaching. And the betrayal, the media circus, the silence from her own country left a scar. But Lydia didn't climb to be believed. She climbed because she just loved the mountains. When the world seemed to turn its back on her, Lydia just kept climbing and chasing the mountains she loved. 20 years after her solo summit, Lydia returned to Everest as a guide. In 2008, she stood on the summit again, this time with a team, but without drama or controversy. And then she did it again and again. In total, Lydia Bradey summited Everest 6 times. She's led successful expeditions all over the world, and at almost 50 years old, she became the first woman in New Zealand certified with the International Federation of Mountain Guides Association, the highest certification in the profession. Years of brutal training went into it: rock, ice, avalanche, safety rescue, and only a handful of guides ever reached that level. She also holds a Canadian Level 2 avalanche forecasting, is a registered physiotherapist, and is a professional speaker. In 2015, she published Going Up is Easy about her first Everest ascent and other adventures and climbs, and it's a fantastic book. You should check it out. She's completed more than 35 expeditions over 6,000 meters, including 10 over 8,000 meters. And in 2020, she was made an Officer of the New Zealand Order of Merit for her service to mountaineering. Lydia didn't just keep climbing, she became one of the best in the world. And still, many people don't even know her name. Today, Lydia speaks about what it means to explore. She says exploring comes in all varieties. You simply just need the unknown and to be curious. Exploring is traveling through unfamiliar terrain in order to learn about it. There's no guaranteed outcome, and that's the point. She says explorers learn when to push and when to turn back. They trust their gut, they adapt, and they stay curious. Exploration teaches decision-making, and that rewires your brain, makes it stronger and smarter. Even taking a small risk, like a tough hike, a cold swim, a difficult garden project, that can build fortitude in you, she says. And the experiences and the choices you make, that's what shapes you. So we're always talking here about why people explore and do these adventures, and I think she has really great insight and answers to it here. And about Everest, Lydia says she's at peace now about it. If you hear interviews with her, she's got such a great attitude about it. She says, that's just life. It's all in the past. Life isn't perfect. It's just what happened. And, now she seems to be getting more and more recognition, even though it's way too late, but at least it's happening. But she also wishes that her story hadn't been overshadowed, that magnificent climb hadn't gotten lost in the noise. But she's also super inspirational because she says if she could do it, someone who could never excel at sports, who was always crappy at sports, then maybe others can do more than they think too. Her story isn't just about summiting Everest, but it's about getting back up after the world tries to erase you. This has become a theme in many of my stories, if you've noticed. She faced public doubt, media backlash. Sound familiar to any other stories about mountaineering women? She got that 3-year ban and the betrayal from her own teammates. Not because she failed, but because she succeeded first. Today, her name still rarely appears in Everest documentaries, but that doesn't mean she's not one of the greats. She's still guiding in her 60s, still leading, climbing, and actually guiding through Adventure Consultants, the same company that Rob Hall started building. And Rob Hall and Gary Ball both died in the 90s. But Lydia kept chasing the mountains that she loved. So that's Lydia's story. I would love to hear your thoughts on it in the comments below. Let me know if you've ever heard of her before or about her story at all. So if you've enjoyed this story, stick around, hit that subscribe button, and like the video while you're at it. And join this crazy crew. Are they around? Dogs are more on the floor than on the couches. I love talking about these stories that really matter. And hey, one other exciting thing, if you're still around, is new merch. We've been working on a store for quite a while, and it's now live. You can go to adventuresgonewrong.com and check out all the cool, awesome merch that is there. And I've also checked out the merch. I've ordered almost all of it myself and tried it all out. So there's some survival tools in there, some mouse pads, this is my favorite, dog bowl. How cool is that? This is an awesome dog bowl. My dogs love it. Water bottle. It was gigantic. Look how big it is. You could keep hydrated all day for weeks on end. And my favorite item is my Adventures Gone Wrong hat with the logo on the front and the hashtag Team Sandy on the back. So if you're a fan of Sandy Hill and you think she's been wronged all these years, buy the hat and show it around and show people, show the world that Sandy deserves a break. Anyways, check it out. Let me know what you think of the merchandise in there. And it's really fun. We've been having a lot of fun with it. There's some funny things in there too. So check it out, and I will see you in the next adventure. Thanks for watching.